So really, what's in a name? How much of our success is based on a name? And I mean that almost at like an individual level. If you have a name that sounds like this or that, does that change much of anything, or does that change it all? I often wonder this about Because I Said I Would, and this phrasing. How much of our success actually came from a happenstance, and where did the origin of this name originate from? Now, a lot of people think that the phrase "because I said I would" must have been something that my father said. You know, as I began this organization after my father died of small cell lung cancer on September 4th of 2012, that thought of him keeping his promises and the title of his eulogy being "Because I Said I Would," people reasonably jumped to the conclusion that must have been his phrase of choice. But I cannot recall literally a single time my father ever said those 5 words in string. And it's not to say that he didn't, but I want to explain a little bit about where this phrase actually came from as I was coming up with the name. There's a couple of reasons for it. The first one is that my father, in not saying this, he said a different version of it that actually came from a more negative perspective and angle, an understandable one, but still more negative. And basically what he would do is he would say, well, your mom said she was going to do this, or you said your brother said, and he would get really upset by the broken promises of others because, quite frankly, he just couldn't understand it very well. Which is why I think in some ways my dad was, I guess it connects to why he was so good with his promises. I really think that the greatest quality of my father wasn't necessarily that like he was a huge humanitarian and had a big heart. He honestly wasn't that way. But it was because he could drag himself through things he didn't want to do. Working double shifts, overtime. I mean, even going to your son's Little League game isn't always, the activity of choice, but you do it because you know you should. And I think a lot of times promises are like that. It's not that we want to go all the time. We just want the result of going. It's not that we want to keep the promise all the time. It's that we want the result of keeping that promise. And I feel like my father could drag himself through things that he just didn't like to do. And when he saw that other people couldn't do that in keeping their promises, he got upset. I had kind of the angry dad. But in that passion, or whatever word you want to use, it also drove him to do the right things for me and my brother. And so, Because I Said I Would actually came from a negative thought. And I mean that in the phrasing of it, but I also mean in the whole thing of it. It's because my dad died. That's why all of it exists, is because of some negative thing. But I often refer to, quote, reference a thought, the strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire. There's a concept, obviously, that many are familiar with, of post-traumatic stress disorder, but there's actually a thought in psychology called post-traumatic growth. That's, for some reason, many of our supporters, something terrible happens and it lights a fire in the right direction. Now, it's not always the case. Sometimes the loss of life, what we see in war, the abuse that somebody might incur, I mean, it may be unrecoverable, and I don't think that's necessarily someone's fault. But I do think, and I do know that at least this name came from, in my mind, a terrible place, and we just try to make the best of it. In the last 6 years since Because I Said I Would started, so much has happened. I think the anniversary for a lot of organizations is sort of this bright spot. I know a statistic or something like a statistic, I can't remember it exactly, about small businesses. Now, we're a charity, but the spirit still remains, is that 90% of like these entrepreneurial ventures in the United States, they don't actually make it to their third year. And while I can't remember if that's the exact number, the notion of it is felt by a lot of people who've had to try to build something on their own. And I think that is why anniversaries are such like a celebration moment for so many, right? We record things like this, we put out a big email newsletter and social media posts, all the things that we're gonna do. And as a founder, and as Amanda Messer, our co-founder, you know, it's such a positive thing that you've survived this long, and for us, for the benefit of hopefully others. But it just doesn't seem like a day that I should celebrate. You know, like everybody says congratulations, but for like what? The day he died, I'm supposed to be happy about that? I know that's not what people mean, but you know, you have feelings that don't always have to connect with people's intentions or even your own. That's part of what self-control is. We can feel one way, but we can think another way, and how do those two things guide each other? And I struggle with that on days like this. September 4th, the day my father died, September 5th, the first post I ever made about because I said I would. I don't feel happy. I don't feel excited. And maybe that's somewhat like my dad. You know, it's not always like this kind of rainbows mentality. He wasn't like that. But he kept at it. I remember that. I remember the sound of him coming home only by the garage door closing because I'm asleep, but he's got to work late at the hospital. I remember him telling you that, you know, the only person in this world you can control is yourself. And so when I feel down, or I feel like, you know, what is it all for? You know, even with all the things that we've done, you know, everybody gets these kind of feelings. I just kind of remember his voice to the best of my ability and keep doing what we're doing. You know, my dad, he used to work so hard. Like, I guess a lot of people say that, but my dad used to work at the hospital for like, you know, his 40, 50, 55 hours a week. And then he would actually take a job at a retail pharmacy on the weekends. And he would moonlight there. And you get paid like a lot of money for that, because the pharmacy, the retail pharmacy, like a CVS or something, they would have like their employees, their pharmacists would have sick days. They would have paid vacation, right? Everybody deserves these things, I would think. But they have to have that pharmacist. And so they would pay a lot of money for, you know, a pharmacist to take the weekend. And so my dad did that. And he would even take his vacation days at work at the hospital, and then he would go and he worked at the retail pharmacy like 70 hours. He would even sometimes pick up in Cleveland to take that job because I lived there, and he just kind of wanted to see me. He also wanted to save money on a hotel, and he knew he could sleep on my couch. But I often would look at my father going to bed or hear him waking up and just not being able to understand how someone could work so hard, because of all this hard work, I was a little bit more privileged, and I thought I could never be that person. But because of the stories of our supporters and the impacts of the commitments they make around the world, I feel that I have the strength that my father once did to work as hard as reasonable, to push forward this cause, to make the most out of all the sacrifices that our supporters, people like you, have made to do what they said they were going to do, not only because they believe in that end result, but because they believe in a wider cause, not the thought of a brand or 5 words, but the thought that someone has to try to represent this idea that we're tired of broken promises, that when you keep a commitment, things start to change in a positive direction. Life is not always easy, but as as my mom used to say to me, whoever told you life was easy, life was fair, well, they lied to you. You know, I really appreciate the work of all of our employees as well, all of our volunteers who've put so much into this, and I want to do my best to build an organization that's worth fighting for. And so we may have our ups and downs, whether that's the reach that we have, whether it's our program effectiveness and trying to improve it, or even our finances. You know, we have had some dark days, but we're gonna try to keep pushing forward to make this something that's worth your support. And I may not do it well, but I'm gonna at least try. Thank you for all of your help over the past 6 years.